This week, I don't know if in the 4 years we've been doing these lectures, if there's anyone who has fallen so far out of collective memory as Ary Scheffer. He is arguably the most important artist we have discussed on a artistic level, from a critical standpoint, and influential on other artists, and politically was at the center of several major events in his own lifetime. I think that as we talk about it, this will become clear how big of a deal he was. You know, that idea of somebody mentions their name and they say, I'm kind of a big deal. Scheffer could have done that unironically his entire life. He was a big deal. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors, the Institute of Classical Art and Architecture, based here in Utah, the Anthony Swinard, of which I'm a partner, the gallery based in Salt Lake, and the Beaux-Arts Academy of Provo. Every one of these institutions work together on a regular basis to bring these kinds of cultural events that are almost always free. Sometimes there are classes that are offered that you can pay for as well, that have world-class instructors. So I encourage you to look them up. This next slide is somewhat ironic, but not at the same time. I just want to spend one slide discussing what happened in France between the onset of the revolution in 1848. The most quixotic slide in maybe the history of slides. How do you discuss what happened in France from the onset of the revolution until the next revolution, really, that happened in 1848? But it's critical that we start off with a little bit of a cultural context of the era that Scheffer lived in. He was born in 1795, and he was the son of two artists whose families had both been displaced by the revolutions and the economics of their time. Scheffer is claimed by a lot of different nations. He was German by birth. He was born in Dordrecht, and then he moved to Amsterdam when his father had lost work, and then found work in the court of Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, who had been put in charge of the Kingdom of Holland. And Scheffer's identity was really influenced heavily by the political revolutions that took place during his lifetime. And what you're going to see as we talk about him and his art is that as a young man, and throughout most of his adult life, he was an idealistic revolutionary. He believed very much in this Enlightenment ideal of a meritocracy over an aristocracy. He believed in a middle class that was trying to not only survive itself, because when we think about the revolution in France, we're thinking of a lot of heady ideals, but one of the practical economic realities is that France and most of Europe had changed from an agricultural-based economy that was about land wealth to one that was becoming industrialized and about production and manufacturing. And it had a middle class that was becoming more empowered and wanted to share in the political power of its time. And this is a big part of what Ary Scheffer was involved in during his lifetime. You're going to see that as we talk about things. But he came up against the contradictions of living as a man who was patronized by the monarchy. And eventually ended his life in kind of critical isolation, having served both sides of the equation. Having served the revolution and having served the monarchy. And the story along the way is just incredible. I got to make sure I've got a book here before we get started. Sorry to move away from cameras. I'm coming right back. Okay, first image. Not the greatest portrait you've ever seen, but this was done by Johann Bernhard Scheffer, who is Ary Scheffer's father. He was a portraitist who had worked in one of the principalities in Germany. Now, think of this. Germany had over 300 principalities when Johann Scheffer began his career. But by the time Napoleon took over Central Europe and had consolidated these 300 plus governments into, I believe it was 18 or 19 governments. This meant that a lot of people who worked for the other 281 principalities that were no longer functioning had to find jobs elsewhere. And that was the story of Johann Scheffer. He and his wife's family, his wife was a miniature artist, were no longer employed because of Napoleon and the revolution that he had instigated in Germany. And he found work in Amsterdam, working directly for Louis Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon. And I have a little bit of a quote from the life of Ary Scheffer, talking about the character of his father. Monsieur Scheffer was a man of honorable character, a respectable artist, and an affectionate father, attached also to his wife, as he might well be. Yet his temper was sullen, reserved, and deficient in sympathy towards those with whom he lived. Hence, the domestic circle was not a happy one. I love this very gentle 19th century way of saying he was a pain to live with. What a difficult, miserable domestic life they lived. He died when Ary was only 9 years old. And so, even though people talk about in his biography about Ary Scheffer growing up in a family of painters and learning his first lessons with his father, Ary, in his own biography, when people are talking to him, he says, yeah, I spent time with my father, but he was a difficult man. So he didn't learn a lot from him, especially because he died at the age of 9. His mother, on the other hand, was a different kind of help. This is a work that was done by Cornelia Lemmy Scheffer. It was the only work I was able to find, only work I was able to find at first. So I don't know if it's a self-portrait or a work of somebody else. But think of this. If you're a female artist of any talent, her father was a well-known landscape painter by the name of Lemmy. You still do not have much of an outlet for your talents. So you do a lot of miniature work, which means that your work shows up on porcelains, on snuff boxes, on brooches, on necklaces. That's how she made a living. And his biographer said about her, Madame Scheffer's means were so inadequate to the demands made upon them, speaking about after the death of Ary's father, her husband. And yet her desire to afford her children all sorts of instruction was so dominant that she became extremely pressed for money. And it was at this period that Ary began to produce those agreeable pictures in which the expression of the gentler sympathies for the interest in subject, a description of composition always certain to attract purchasers. He was making his first works for commercial sale at the age of 11. Young man. And I wasn't able to find the ones that were verifiably from the age of 11, but I was given by a museum, the Musée de la Vie Romantique, which is it's in Paris and it's his former home, had some of his earliest works. This is in Grenoble. So, when I told you he was making agreeable images, did you think I was going to put up an image of a widow with her orphans? Probably not. Here's another work, The Soldier's Wife, also wearing black. The Orphans. So, my question is, how sellable would these images be today? What do you think?
They're not happy.
They're not happy? So what are you saying? Are you saying that we like happy images? Who here has ever lived in a Russian, Eastern Orthodox, or a Catholic country? They have a different perspective on suffering than we do. Definitely. I remember I was in Spain recently, and I was talking with an older woman out in the countryside, and I said, "How are you doing today, ma'am?" And she said, "Oh, sufro, I suffer." She wasn't saying, not the typical American, "I'm great." It was, "I suffer." We have kind of lost, especially in Protestant countries, this appetite and this interest in having images that express the full spectrum of human emotions. And suffering is a big part of it. And also think of the time that they're in. He's doing these in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, which by the numbers didn't equal the First and Second World Wars in the number of people that were killed. But as a percentage of people who were killed in the population, almost equaled what happened. These are times where these images would have been the kind of thing you'd have in your house to remind you of the great suffering that had gone on around you during this time, and to remember the orphans and the widows. It was also a great time for funerary monuments that I would love to be able to go back to that time. At 11 years old, he was put into the Amsterdam Academy of Art. Great sacrifice of his mother, who bet the farm on Ary. She had 3 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter died at the age of 5. And she bet all that she had, selling family land, taking in extra work, trying to sell miniatures, to send Ary to Amsterdam to study. He studied there, and when he was 12 years old, he entered a work into the local salon, and was the only one under the age of 25 years old. He was only 12. I'm not sure this is the image. According to 2 sources, this is the image, but I'm not entirely sure myself. But look at what he's doing as a young man. He's doing figural work, multi-figural work. Can you see the neoclassical elements in there? This sabered leg chair. I mean, it's not quite a Jacques-Louis David of Socrates, and the coloring wouldn't quite be that, but it's, for a 12-year-old, if that's indeed what this is, not bad, right? Not bad at all. He then goes to Lille, a little closer to where he needs to be in Paris. Amsterdam's a little bit of a backwater, according to the Artistic Center of the World in Paris. He goes to Lille. I don't have any images from that time or know who taught him. And then he's accepted to the Paris École des Beaux-Arts, which is like going from the minor leagues immediately into the big leagues. And his first teacher is Pierre-Paul Prud'hon, who is arguably, in my opinion, one of the greatest draftsmen in the history of art when it comes to the human figure. We don't have a lot about his time working with Prud'hon. We do know that he felt inadequate after leaving. He was one of the youngest people to study at the École des Beaux-Arts when he was there. And there was a lot of hazing that went on. There's a story that I read from about this time that a young student who had been in the École des Beaux-Arts for his first week, he had been painted blue and hung from the 3rd-story balcony across the street and rescued by neighbors. Think of this. These are a bunch of teenagers and men in their early 20s. I mean, this is worse than an Ivy League school in the 20th century. If you were going there, there is some serious. He's far away from home. He's kind of like a Doogie Howser character. He's only 16, 17, 18 years old when he's there, and most of the kids are 5 to 10 years older than he is, and he's probably the last one to get fed at the end of the day, artistically. We do know that he was taken into the studio of Pierre Narcisse Guérin, who was the biggest name at the École des Beaux-Arts at the time, who was teaching at the École des Beaux-Arts. Now, Guérin had won maybe his greatest fame for this work, Morpheus and Iris, which showed at the Salon of 1811. And if you had to place him within a movement, where would you put him? He was on the border of Romantic with the movement that came before it, with Neoclassicism. And I have to be careful about this, because we as art historians, we love isms. We love categorizing and filing away art neatly into certain categories. And this is one that doesn't fit neatly into a category. He considered himself a neoclassicist, and you can definitely see it. And if you had to say what are the neoclassicist elements in this work, what would you say? Yes?
Triangular.
Okay, so he's got some very strong geometric composition going on here, right? Yeah, that's true. Yes.
Idealization of the figure.
What do you mean? That is how a woman and man look.
In your dreams.
Isn't that just an interesting...
He's been looking at a lot of Greek sculpture.
Yeah, he's looking at a lot of Greek sculpture. The part that really gets me is the woman's torso, right? Especially that very odd bend. I mean, it almost looks, and she wouldn't have known this today, but it almost looks like a store mannequin, right? You could just pop off those legs and arms and interchange them with other parts. It's a very idealized and symmetrical form. You could put a line down the middle of her face or the middle of her torso, and you would have, almost perfect symmetry on either side. Do we like it? And I know that's a very
Aspects
subjective
of it,
question.
yeah, it has nice design.
Yeah, I mean, this piece is in the Hermitage, and it is one of their treasures. It is a remarkable, at the time, he was considered the top of the top. And we have a work that was done 3 years later by Scheffer when he was in the studio of Johann. It was the first work he was accepted into the Salon in Paris. He was 19 years old at the time. Orpheus and Eurydice. So, compare and contrast. What is he learning from his teacher?
Flesh tones.
Flesh tones. Are they realistic, naturalistic, I should say?
They are idealized.
Okay.
Very white and light. Pure. So.
They're both borrowing from Ovid.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking at classical sources, so subject-wise, they're definitely in the classical realm. Clothing-wise, the way that they're handling drapery, the way that they're also handling form, there's a kind of imaginative quality to both of them. It's interesting. I think one of the most interesting things about this is how much Scheffer has departed from his teacher in doing a landscape that is so complicated. I mean, it's a really remarkable background. In fact, to me, that may be the most compelling part of the piece, is how he draws you into that background and how he handles the space and depth of that, going from this strong, detailed framing around the figures of the foliage and the kind of hill and the ground that they're on, and that deep background it takes you into, and how atmospheric it is. It's a really remarkable arsenal. He's 19 years old at this point. He complains a lot as he gets older that he didn't learn anything from Johann. And in fact, his good friend, Viardot, who was a great historian and poet from the time, wrote about it later. It was a school through which Ary Scheffer passed, learning but little beyond art of framing. In time, it became a system of study for himself. It is in this way that most of us have gone through our college period. Anyone relate to that? I think a lot of us feel that way, that you go through an experience because you feel like it's the way that you're supposed to do this. You're supposed to go through the École des Beaux-Arts. But the way that these academies worked in the 19th century is that you would go to these schools, and it was mostly run by the head student, who was chosen by Johann or whatever master there was. And 90% of your time was spent with that head student and the other students. And usually once a week, the master would come in and critique everybody's drawings. But Johann was such an absentee teacher that he didn't show up even sometimes in a month. So the experience that he had at the École des Beaux-Arts was not ideal in any way. He had a second work that was famous during his time, that he did the same year, that was also accepted into the Salon. And it's the story of the burghers of Calais. Does anyone know that story off the top of their head? Can you give us an elevator summary of it? So, go ahead. Do you recognize the title from another work in art?
Mm-hmm.
It's famous for this work, right? Burghers of Calais by Rodin. It has a political context because the burghers of Calais were a group of people in Calais in Normandy who were sieged. They were French, and they were sieged by Edward III's army in the 14th century. And the King of France, who at that time was Philippe VI, ordered the burghers, who were the town leaders, to hold the keep at any cost. And one of the costs that that was one of the last measures before the town, I think, was eventually saved, was when the burghers, who were the elected town leaders, allowed themselves to be led out by nooses, and taken to be hung. Now, this piece hung in Versailles when Rodin saw it. And Rodin was directly influenced by Ary Scheffer and talked about it in his own time. Can you see some of the similarities that they have? I mean, one's a three-dimensional sculptural work. For one, costume. Do you see him? He's isolated the costumes that are just in this portion. And I think there is a parallel to be made between this figure and arguably this figure right here, right? But, here he is, 19 years old, and he's already starting to make waves at the salon. Now think about the times they're in and politically the context for this. The revolution had come and gone. The revolution had arguably failed. Even though it had deposed many of the aristocracy, Napoleon joined the government and then took over the government and installed himself as an emperor. And then the French had gone through the very unfortunate period after the death of Napoleon of fighting a series of mini revolutions and trying to keep the ideals alive. And you've got to think of this as a battle between those who want to keep the revolution alive and its ideals towards a middle class, towards a meritocracy, and this very kind of heady idealism that has very little practical application. You've got kind of these ultra-liberals that are trying to impose these ideals in an impractical way on the state. And I know that's unfair in some ways to them. But then you've got a group of conservatives who want to wrest back the power that was taken from them during the revolution. And Ary was clearly in the first camp, and he saw the burghers of Calais when he talks about it, and other people talked about it, as a kind of historical reference to this idea of we need to do everything as citizens, like the burghers of Calais did, to resist the tyranny of monarchy and of an imposition. So even his first works are the Orpheus and Eurydice, the story of Orpheus, looking back at Eurydice and her dying, was also a parable about looking back at France and hoping for monarchy to come back and being a viable way forward. And he was writing at this time even as a young man. His brother, Ary Scheffer, became a famous liberal journalist, was talking about how this metaphor of France needs to not look back at this time. Yes?
What do you think, the figure in the middle of the right,
Yes.
that has the ermine cape that's very royal looking,
Are we talking about...
up here that someone is holding?
Oh, here?
Yes, right there.
Yeah.
What do you think that signifies there? I mean, the ermine looks like monarchy.
Part of what's interesting about this image, and I think about a lot of Scheffer's images, is that he goes back to this old master ideal of, and this is just me guessing because I don't have a lot to rest it on other than precedents, is that in your images you have to have kind of a theater of the world, of everyone reacting from different classes, different backgrounds to what's happening. And in this image, he is definitely showing high and low people mourning the fall of their state, which is an elected state, right? So he's kind of showing everyone from this ermine royal person to maybe some of these more humble figures wanting their elected government to succeed. So we're all in on this, no matter what class we're part of. And in the context of his time, that would have really meant a great deal. So, I want to say something here about Romanticism before we get started. And that is, there are a lot of people who tell you what Romanticism is. They'll tell you that it's about emotion, that it's about a certain kind of anti-intellectual approach to things in the face of the Enlightenment and classicism. But the answer probably that I've found is the most clear definition is that, just like almost every other movement, is that it's a reaction to what came before. That may be the clearest definition. And maybe nothing says that more clearly than Viardot in this comment. He says in the 50-year period from 1778 to 1828 may be said to comprehend the whole existence of the classical school. So he's talking at the death of Ary Scheffer. Ary Scheffer died in 1858. And Viardot, who's this famous poet and historian, is trying to summarize how Ary Scheffer fit into his period. And he says, look, 1778 to 1828, this was the classical period. And from its birth, it was engendered by an impatience of the public for the false taste, imperfect science, insipidity, and coarseness which characterized the preceding condition of art. In other words, classicism was a reaction to Boucher and Fragonard, who were doing silly paintings of people in silk, right? They weren't serious works. This is according to the classical standpoint that he's kind of parodying. Down to its final decay, this school, in its best days, rose to a high level of merit. He's talking about classicism. By the captivations of novelty, joined to great artistic capacity, it persuaded an entire generation to concentrate its admiration upon the merits of correct design and painting, to admit no other type in respect to human beauty than that of the antique, as displayed in Greek and Roman sculptures. So, how big of a fan of the antique is Virardot? Of Greco-Roman classics? How big of a fan is he? He is not. Why isn't he? If you just have this statement to base it on. Does he agree that it reached this level of greatness? But what does he attribute that greatness to?
Skill.
He does attribute it to, he calls it, joined by the captivations of novelty and great artistic capacity. Which is another way of saying there were a few rock stars, right? So he would say probably Gruez, David, he'd probably put a few other people in that category of really great classicists who got public imagination going. And he also, it seems like one of the things that he thinks was its success was that it created a system of correct design, right? That's what he liked about it. What he felt like people liked about it is that compared to what happened before, the great thing that classicism had to offer was a playbook for people. How far away is Virardot from the way a lot of people think about classicism today? I know I'm in here with a bunch of classicists. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a different time. So there's different,
it is a different time.
There's different things going on. But yeah, I think that's one of the critiques of classicism you hear often is that it's just about the past.
Yeah.
It's just about things that are old and it's not relevant anymore. It doesn't speak to us today. We got our own problems, our own concerns that we need a new style, we need a new answer.
We need a new language because this language is from the past, right? And we need to speak in our own language. We need bell bottoms. We don't want skinny ties anymore, right? And then we don't want bell bottoms. We want shoulder pads and gunny sack dresses. And then we want leather jackets and army boots. And now we want bell bottoms again, right? It's put it in another sense. What's interesting about this is that you can't divorce politics and feelings from aesthetics, right? Is you've got this issue of neoclassicism was associated very much with the end of Louis XVI and Napoleon's empire style, right? And you hear them saying, especially in the beginning, we need a new style to talk about what we are doing. And you hear the same thing happen with Schoenberg and the Futurists and everybody after World War I. You hear, oh, classicism and those traditional, that was the art of the Ancien Regime, that was the art of the royals, and you hear people talk about, oh, we can't do monumental classical buildings because that's what the Nazis used, right? It's every period has its action and reaction. And the reaction for Romanticism, maybe the most dominant work that came out of the beginning to define it, was Géricault's work, The Wrath of the Medusa, which was a very political work. It's a life-size. Who here has seen it in person? It is overwhelming. It is enormous. I don't think until you're away from it, until you see it in person, you understand how big it is. It is the size of the raft, and the story, as the quickest summary I can come up with, is that Charles X's new navy had been put in order, and they'd been sent on a fairly routine run with a group of, I think, over 130 people on board of a ship. And Charles X, wanting to distinguish his people that he had appointed from the people who Napoleon had running the navy before, who were not loyal to him, installed a whole group of people who had very little experience. And the result was that this ship, which was on a routine run, ran into disaster, and almost everyone died on it. And it became a huge cause célèbre in France. Jericho interviewed everyone and even did portraits from life and had the raft reproduced from first-hand accounts reproduced and put in a warehouse where he painted from life on it. And just notice, he's working from life. He's doing dramatic darks and lights. It's a very emotional work, right? This is meant to be over-the-top, theatrical. This is a scene in a movie where the people are uncontrollably weeping, right? This is not a scene that is cool and calm and collected where you know people are talking about being sad. This is the opposite of neoclassicism. This is not a rational painting in any way. And Scheffer, after Jericho died, who was 24, they were only a few years apart from one another. They were Jericho was 3 years older than Scheffer, and they knew one another. But, here it is. This is a painting that's done 3 years after the other painting we just seen. How much has changed in Scheffer's approach?
It's more realistic.
Okay, so it's observational. It's from life, right? You're seeing actual people sitting in chairs, in beds, in interior scenes. Palette-wise, has it changed?
More subtle.
He doesn't have classical costume anymore, right? And he still works those lights and darks quite a bit. This goes into the Louvre's collection. It's hanging there. You can see it today. But, Scheffer, I'm going to go to this piece. Chopin became a friend of his. He did this about 1840. He becomes friends with Liszt. He becomes friends with Theory. He gets to know Goethe a little bit during his lifetime. And he definitely changes almost entirely from being somebody who's toying around with neoclassical ideals to somebody who's looking in every other direction than neoclassicism in the first part of his career. And he's very successful, especially as a portraitist. A family friend wrote about him. Scheffer had become not only for the father of his own family. Remember, his father dies when he's 9. His mother bets the farm on him, sends him to school, and Scheffer makes it. By the time he's 19 years old, his mother and brothers are all coming to Paris to live with Ary, and Ary sends his brothers to school, and he takes in distant relatives as well. And his mother becomes his chief copyist. Isn't that interesting? I don't know if there's any other person in the history of art. Almost everyone in the 19th century, when they have a successful salon piece, has copies made of it by their studio. I don't know how many of them had their mother doing it. It was him. He was regarded as the holder of the stock purse into which all might dip their hands when money was wanted. Friends, brothers, artists, all who were in need had recourse to Scheffer's kind aid, for to no application he could turn a deaf ear. He was in many ways, this revolutionary compatriot who believed in helping anyone and everyone he could. He was not only idealistic in the way that he lived, but he was also actually that way. Now, there's a turn of events. He becomes a portraitist who is hired by the Duc d'Orléans. He becomes King Louis Philippe to do the family portraits. The first portrait that he does is of the Duc d'Orléans himself, 1826. And he also does Marie d'Orléans. In 1830, they become King Louis Philippe and Queen Marie. And Scheffer had some real reservations about this. Before I do that, I got to show you a piece that he did that he was famous for that came out about the same time. Nope, not that one. That was Delacroix. 1827, about the same time, he's painting the portraits of these aristocrats, these Bourbon aristocrats. He does Les Femmes Solutes. Does anybody know who the Solutes were? Anybody ever heard this story?
Something to do with the Ottoman Empire. They were invading, and
It becomes the inspiration for a lot of songs and
instead of
films.
potentially being ravished by the Ottomans, they killed themselves and
Oh, yeah.
killed their children too.
You've got it. Okay, so the story is then in 1803, the Ottoman Empire is encroaching on Europe. And this is important from a philosophical perspective. Because in France, what's at stake for Scheffer and his generation is the revolution versus the return back to democracy as a return back to aristocracy and the Bourbons. So a lot of the people who are sympathetic towards the revolutionary moment are painting Greek scenes which represent a proxy war for Europe and for the Democrats and for the revolutionaries of the difference between monarchy and democracy. Greece is democracy, and they represent our people and all the gains that we could potentially have in the revolution. And in 1803, the Salutes were living on Suli, and Ali Pasha, who was the Ottoman Albanian emperor who was invading Greece, started coming closer and closer, and he killed all of the men, and the women had been led to a precipice. They'd been hiding up on the precipice of this mountain. And the first thing that the women did in order to avoid being taken as basically sexual slaves of the Ottomans was to throw the children from the cliff to their deaths, and then to jump themselves from their death. There is actually a monument that was built in 1961 that is on the rocks of Zolongo, where this historical event took place. Has anybody ever seen this monument in real life? It's something I'd like to see in person. You can imagine what Scheffer's trying to say in this moment, and that is, at this moment we have an opportunity as a nation to go towards the Bourbons and potentially have to throw ourselves off the cliff as revolutionaries if that happens, or we can fight. We can fight. And Delacroix, just 3 years earlier, had this piece, which was another massacre painting that's about the same size as the one that he did. It's also about this idea of what happens when democracy is threatened. So you have Scheffers on the left, and you have Delacroix on the right. He was clearly looking at it. This is a bad reproduction. I've got another one that's also not great, but it's better. You can see how Scheffer painted. Here's an up close. What do we think about his skill set now? Let's set aside the subject. Figuratively, how's he doing?
Gorgeous.
He gets branded almost immediately as the complacent servant of a royal bourgeoisie family by the press for doing this. And there's a story I want to read to you, because not only does he do their portraits, but he's hired as the drawing teacher for the children of the family. And there's this moment that's his biographer says, and I just got to read it. And as illustrative of the self-respect and independence of the young painter, I will here mention an anecdote which may be relied upon as authentic. During one of the lessons which, at a later stage, Scheffer was giving to the children of the royal family, one of the brothers, the princes, forgot the respect due to the master, and used some unbecoming expressions towards him, labeling Scheffer as a craftsman. Scheffer banished the offending prince from the lesson. The queen interposing to obtain a remission of this penalty, Scheffer resigned his appointment as the royal painter. The brothers and sisters were so grieved and discomposed at the loss of their master that they begged and entreated him to resume his position. Yet he was inexorable until the king himself, adding his own earnest endeavors, Scheffer was induced to give way, and he presided over their artistic studies. But he made it a condition that the mutinous pupil should never more join the lesson, and was accordingly excluded for the rest of his days. I am afraid it must be added that this incident was long remembered by both parties. Think about this. Think about this. A revolutionary gets hired by the royal family to do what he does best. He is a salon painter who has graduated from some of the greatest institutions, and the children who are being taught that they have been born into a royal family and are therefore higher than those around them, that there are aristocrats and peasants, treat their teacher as somebody who's not royal. And what does he do? He says, I am not having this. And he relished the story of the king had to beg him to come back to teach. This is the kind of balance that he maintains as an artist working for the royal family. I'll tell you another story in a moment that shows how far he ended up coming the other way. But before then, let's talk about Paolo and Francesca. Does anyone want to tell us what the story of Paolo and Francesca is? Does anybody know where it's from?
It's from Dante.
It's from Dante.
It has something to do with hell. There's
Okay, so
I knew it one time.
Dante is the man in the red. Anyone know who the man with the laurels around his head is? What's that?
Virgil.
It is Virgil, the Roman poet of the Aeneid. So Dante was an actual figure. Virgil was an actual figure. And Dante was writing in the 14th century, 1300s, is that right?
Yeah.
And he was a Florentine poet who was writing about contemporary figures and a lot about the philosophy of punishment, reward. And he imagines himself going through the various circles of hell and the punishments that those who have died suffer in purgatory, which isn't the final place where souls go, but it is the in-between place that you go to suffer for the errors that you committed during your lifetime if they haven't been purged while you were alive. And he uses real characters. Paolo and Francesca were actual people who Dante had known during his lifetime in 14th century Florence. Francesca was the daughter of a noble family who was going to be married to Francesco's brother. Francesco's brother, there's no way around it, was a jerk. He was a terrible, angry, ugly human being, and no one wanted to deal with him. But he was powerful politically. And so the families were content for them to be married, even though they were sad that Francesca was marrying this person. And they negotiated that all of the affairs of business between the families as they prepared for this meeting were handled by not her intended husband-to-be, but by his brother, who everyone loved. And then one day, the brother enters, who's the intended bride, the bridegroom, finding his brother and his wife-to-be in a compromising position. He takes out his sword and stabs his brother through the heart, and the sword goes all the way through and kills Francesca as well. Which is why the sword is going through the right breast of Paolo and coming out the middle of Francesca. And why? What kind of position are they in?
Flagrante delicto.
You would think so. You would think they're in flagrante delicto. But their punishment in purgatory is as they were thrown about by their passions during their lifetime, they were tossed about by wind during their entire time in purgatory. Because the punishment of those who could not restrain themselves in their lifetime meant that their punishment in purgatory was that they would be blown about. Interesting, right? Interesting imagination. So Dante and Virgil are there witnessing them being thrown about in the wind for just a moment. And Scheffers have caught them at this. At least they have each other, is part of what he says, at least as they're being caught up in the wind. It was a smashing success. The original is in the Wallace collection in London. He makes at least 5 copies. I've seen 4 of them. This is one that is in the Kunsthalle in Hamburg. Notice the size difference. This is 167 by 234, so it's roughly what, 9 by 12 feet. This one is less than half that size. This one is about the same size as the original, the one that's in the Louvre in Paris. Here are all 3 side by side. And the difference is, this one was done in 35, 54, 55. So, the last 2 were done 20 years later almost. How faithful is he to his copies?
Looks like he's pretty faithful.
He's pretty faithful, right? He's pretty remarkably faithful. I don't know if he kept a studio copy or not, but this is typical practice of the salon. Is that you'd be expected to recall your greatest hits and paint them for a commission. About the same time, Eng is doing this work, and he's finding very little patronage. He's very upset about it, and it's the same year that this wins at the salon. That Eng leaves Paris in a huff, not being appreciated, in part because he sees Scheffer being appreciated, and goes back to Rome, and he takes over the French Academy there. But the year before, or 3 years before, this is what's being done by De La Roche. And that may be the
That's
greatest
massive,
compare and contrast. Right? What were you going to say? What did you
That
say?
is massive too.
And they're both, Scheffer's is a little larger. It's a little larger. But if you had to compare and contrast, is there a relationship in their style here? If you just had these two paintings? And if so, what is the relationship? Palette?
Palette.
Palette is one?
Chiaroscuro.
Yes, this very strong emphasis on light and dark. I mean, the palette is remarkably
Beautiful
close. isn't it?
people. I mean, the people are
Yeah,
gorgeous.
is this the kind of figure that Jericho or Delacroix would do? Is this an idealized, naturalistic, or ugly figure? I mean, if you had to put it on a spectrum of these figures being supernatural, like, I mean very natural is what I mean, not supernatural. Very natural and observed versus very idealized, where would they fit on the spectrum for you?
Somewhere in between.
Somewhere in between, but toward idealized.
You would put it towards idealized. Anybody disagree? Also, look at this manipulation of the fabric and how he's, I mean, to me, he's going back to classicism on some level. I mean, this is not an observed scene. This is an imaginative, idealized moment in many ways, where he's illustrating a classic, right? He's not going back to Ovid, but he's going to Dante. I mean, in many ways, De La Roche is the more romantic of the two of them in the subject, and the one who's doing more to pull on your heartstrings than Scheffer is. And you have to think of these two as being they're competing with one another, but they're in different realms, because De La Roche is kind of the darling of the Academy, and he's doing the hemicycle at this moment, and he's doing big government commissions. But Scheffer is the one who's winning most of the awards popularly, and he's working for the royal family. And he's taken into the royal family. After the royal family is installed in 1830, and the kind of government that is formed under Louis Philippe is a constitutional monarchy very much after the manner of the English, which means no one is happy, right? You've got the liberals who think that the revolution has been sold out and that the lower and middle classes are no longer having a share in power. And you get the monarchy who feel like they're not sharing power. And I think it was Franz Joseph who refused to take on a constitutional government like the King of England, saying, I'd rather chop wood than live like the King of England. This is the kind of thing that's happening in France, though, and it's an unhappy, unproductive period that lasts about 18 years. And Scheffer is living through it. Until 1848. And in 1848, he is part of the royal guard who is protecting the royal family. And here's a quote. In 1848, Scheffer fought at the head of his company during all three of those terrible days, and I have heard it said, that he showed ability as a leader, no less cool, undaunted, and brave. Now here's a quote from 10 years earlier that I skipped, and I got to go back to because it's such a great quote. It's less than 10, it's more than 10 years earlier. We were all young men, and we were become Frenchmen with our whole soul. As such, we entered into a political agitation of our time. The youth of France entertained towards the Bourbon dynasty that general mistrust and dislike, which came to a regular outburst in the year of 1830. With this view, conspiracies, secret societies, and schemes were set a-going, in which we all bore our share. I may even say that we played a leading part in them. Our personal liberty, our life indeed, was imperiled by these proceedings. Our mother was not uninformed of them, but she respected our convictions. So, 1822, revolutionary. 1848, he's helping save the royal family. And I'm going to tell you, while I put up this image here of him that he did of the royal family addressing the court at the time. Let's see if I can find it. I'm going to tell you a brief story. If you'll be so kind to be patient as I share this. It was, oh, come on. Micah. Here we are. Okay.
So he didn't redeem himself by building a shredder into his painting.
No. It was towards noon on the morning of the 24th of February, 1848, that Monsieur Scheffer, having been on duty as captain of the National Guard ever since daylight, met Monsieur Oscar de Lafayette, the son of Lafayette, who had helped in the American Revolution, who was himself a general, Oscar de Lafayette, who was in search of him. Scheffer, said Oscar, it is mighty disagreeable to be obliged to expose one's life for the monarchy which one does not esteem. But nevertheless, it is our duty, and we must go and defend it at all price. Scheffer assented. They repaired to the garden in the Tuileries, and they were waiting under a large window when they hear a woman say, Scheffer. Again cried the same voice, Scheffer. Who calls? Cried Scheffer. It is I, the Queen. Scheffer sprang up, approached the chateau, and perceived the Queen at the croisée. He said, what does your Majesty want with me? I want you, she said, to assist in conducting us out of the chateau. The king has abdicated and we are going to depart. Scheffer and Oscar Lafayette immediately entered the chateau in the intention to ascend to the king's apartments, but they had not gone halfway up when they met the king and queen, their sons and sons' children, together with the Duchess of Orleans and her two sons, all coming hurriedly down the stairs. The queen said, Scheffer, keep close to the king. Your uniform will inspire respect. The king gave his right arm to the queen, and they all set out to proceed through the gardens. And they went to a main gate. Scheffer, knowing the impossibility of getting them away unrecognized, shook off his cap and waving it in the air, called out to the revolutionaries, God save the king. The people offered no resistance, and seeing that it was Scheffer the revolutionary, let them pass. Remisses in the king's hereafter, and they went through 5 more barricades. And on the 6th barricade, Scheffer exchanged clothes with the king so that he could pass through safely. Scheffer is the one who escorted the royal family into exile into Belgium. And it was well recognized in the press at the time. His brother, who was a revolutionary journalist at the time, said that his brother should have stabbed his knife directly into the heart of the Bourbon monarchy when he had a chance that day. So, think of this. This is a man who's gone from doing revolutionary paintings and revolutionary work, risking his own life, even fighting at the barricades in the 1820s, to someone who now in the 1840s, when the barricades go up again, is the one leading the king through it in order to make sure that he gets on the other side. Yes?
In between there, he did the shipwreck, where
He did, yeah.
the mistake had been to hire people who weren't qualified.
That was Jericho before.
Oh, Jericho, okay.
Yes, so he did that before. He did, before he joined the royal family, this work, which was all about resisting the monarchy. And he also did, there are a few images I'm leaving out, but his images were staunchly anti-monarchy until he was hired to do the portrait and then joined the family. And as we heard from the story of teaching the young princes, he had a lot of issues. It was said in another biography that I read of him in preparation for this lecture that he got along with the Duchess, but he refused on a regular basis to talk with the king because he was so opposed to the monarchy that he didn't want to be seen as being friendly with him. So here's a man of two minds in many ways. He's an interesting figure, and he shows up in French history books more for his escorting the king out than for his images.
Double think.
Yeah. So, 1831, Goethes Faust is published. And it defines, in many ways, Scheffer's output and the early editions of Faust by Goethe. For anyone who knows the story of, we're changing gears a little bit, of Goethes Faust, it's very much a romantic story. It's about a man who has reached the limits of what men can know and experience. Dr. Faust is an alchemist, so he's a magician and alchemist. He's a doctor of medicine. He's a philosopher. He's a poet. He knows everything that can be known by humans. He's basically a child of the Enlightenment in many ways, according to those who had read the book at the time. And he was a parody of those who had of people like Rousseau and help me out there, Michael. Voltaire. He was a parody of Voltaire. And Mephistopheles, who's Satan, shows up and offers him an opportunity to experience what knowledge and study cannot give him. And in part one of the book, he's given the love of a woman. And Scheffer is obsessed with this story during his early years. He does many, many sketches, and it's hard to date many of them. But in the first part of the story, I can tell you, I can piece a little bit of it together. Faust and Mephistopheles make a bargain. Mephistopheles shows Faust a beautiful woman and says, I will give you this woman, and a child will come as a result of it, and they will make you happy. And Faust sells his soul for the opportunity to have that woman and that child. And he sees on the street the woman, Marguerite. She's called Gretchen, which is the familiar term for Margaret in German, and they just call her Marguerite in French. He sees her on the street for the first time, and this was Scheffer's most reproduced painting of the 19th century. Marguerite at the Well. Now, what do we think of Scheffer and where he fits into art stylistically at this moment? What is this painting?
Reminds me a little bit of a Bouguereau.
Well, and Bouguereau came later,
Yeah.
but what reminds you of it?
I guess the neoclassical aspects.
You know, I look at it and I think of Bronzino and Parmigianino. That's what I look at. I look at somebody who's willing to exaggerate anatomy for line and beauty. What do you think, Michael? Do you feel that way too when you look at it?
Yeah, but it's also a genre painting.
It's genre painting. Say more about what you mean by genre painting, because this is a very useful term.
Well, it's a depiction, a kind of idealized depiction of everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, he's using a piece of literature that everyone knows, but this is not about gods or religious figures. This is a normal peasant woman at a well who's idealized.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
No.
No? Thank you. But he's also borrowing a lot of formulas. I mean, that's basically this kind of caryatid figure, right? That he's borrowing from. She's one of the most common figures of the 19th and 18th centuries. This figure that's carrying water. And Scheffer, he does everything so well, in my opinion, in this work. What do you think about his figurative work? How is he doing? He's very insecure at this point. I found a quote at this moment when somebody is complimenting his work and he says, "Oh, but I never learned how to do the figure properly because I had such poor teachers." Do you think it's true? And I don't think it's false modesty. He was very insecure his entire life. What do you think about his figurative work?
I think it's beautiful.
You do?
I don't know though. She's got an awful thick neck. And
that is an Eng neck if I've ever seen one. This is an exaggerated. Shoulders and necks don't work that way, right? But it's deliberate. It's a deliberate manipulation of reality towards an idealized.
It's like the super cop.
Yeah. He does a number of images to deal with Marguerite. They fall in love, they conjugate, and as a result, she becomes pregnant and has a child. She repents of this sin of having the child. She drowns the child and gets thrown into hell. And Faust saves her, and in the end, both he and Marguerite are saved. But Michael's observation is a very good one. Each one of these scenes, even though they're about literature, is an idealized moment. But here's one of the interesting things about this: this is one of the few things that happened with Scheffer's work. Few times this happened with Scheffer's work, where it wasn't just popularly appreciated, but it was moments of it were isolated and reproduced because they were considered artistically great achievements from the time. And this was something that De La Roche it was one of the first times that De La Roche had something positive to say about Ary Scheffer and his work. You have to think of Scheffer as being kind of the popular champion at the time of his work. Even in the subjects that he chose, he's working a lot from literature. And he's submitting these works on a regular basis to the Salon and winning the top awards for them, or winning at least high awards. And he's kind of gotten away, if you've noticed, from political images. Part of that is because during the 1830s and 1840s, political images aren't as en vogue as they used to be. So it's not just him who's changing. His last work that he ever put in was this: St. Augustine and his mother. And if those of you who've read the Confessions of St. Augustine, his mother is the driving force behind his sainthood in many ways, bringing him back to the fold after years of spending his life doing other things. And this becomes a moment of departure for him and the art community for the rest of his life. He submits this, and remember, we're just within a few years of people like Courbet taking over. And Baudelaire, who is increasingly in favor of a new modern way of painting, writes the most scathing essay that I think I've ever read in the history of art, and he writes it about Ary Scheffer and this painting. He says, "Formerly, Monsieur Scheffer enjoyed the public's favor in his poetical pictures. People rediscovered their dearest memories of great poets, and that was enough for them. This kind of painting is so wretched, so dismal, so blurred, and so muddy. In my opinion, they are more like pictures by Monsieur Delaroche which have been left out in a heavy rainstorm." Falls out of favor, and Scheffer says, "I'm done." He doesn't submit any works to the Salon from then on out. But he works for another 20 years. And most of his works are for private commissions only. And I'm about to show you those. But before I do, I'm going to show you what happened right after this. He goes to England. And he marries for the first time. I think he's 54 when he marries for the first time. And that has to be put in context of, here's a man who is taking care of an extensive family of more than 30 people. And he rarely, if ever, has time for himself. And he finally marries a woman who's a widow, who has her own family. She's English. Now think of this. He's German-born, raised in Holland, goes to France, marries an English woman, speaks 6 languages, and is a revolutionary who is spending his extra time with Liszt and Chopin. And now he's spending time with British people who are also, George Eliot, one of their good friends, and was spending time at their home. So parts of Middlemarch were written at his home. And he sees the Parthenon sculptures. And this is what he says about them to his daughter, who becomes an artist. "I profited by my short stay to the British Museum, where the marbles of the Parthenon are deposited. You know all about the famous theft committed by Lord Elgin." I love that it's 1850, and there's already a political furor about this that's going on, and he takes a side, right? "Well, my dear child, nothing in the whole range of art can come up to them for beauty, for grandeur of conception, and for truth. Those immortal beings must positively have existed. Nay, they live even now in these very fragments. So long as one has not beheld the marbles themselves, no copies can convey a just idea of what they are, not even the casts, it should say, in plaster." A romantic, non-neoclassical artist? What do we think of this man? Where has he gone philosophically? Completely different place, right? Completely different place from Viardot, who was writing about him and about their mutual opinion of the art that had come before. Have any of you ever gone through a similar transformation in your mature years, finding that the things of your youth and the dislikes of your youth were different? Have any of you gone being told that Bach was better than the Rolling Stones, only to go back to Bach? In a way, this is what's happening, right? It happens to many people.
It's in all of us, right?
Yeah.
We all have that.
Yeah. It's not even a time issue. It's not an issue of an era that you're born into. This is a matter of, I think he's not even making philosophical comments to his daughter about classicism. He's making statements about how inspiring they were to see in person. These are real people. These are incredible works. He's not even trying to make a philosophical statement about we need to go back to classicism. He's just having an honest reaction, and he's open to being inspired by them. He's also not the other way where he's saying, I went to go see these statues, and I was taught and I thought that I'd hate them, but I was surprised at how great they were, right? He doesn't feel like he needs to make a statement in that direction either. He's just having an honest reaction with them. And this is the year that he gets married, and he makes a marriage painting that to me shows, and it's after he's seen the Parthenon sculptures, he makes this work that is about heavenly and earthly love, which is a reference to Titian's sacred and profane love, which contrasts a woman who's chaste and has a keep in the mountains that is guarded versus another woman who is scantily clad and holding up an oil lamp that's burning next to a very phallic building in the background. I mean, there's very much this comparison between the two, right, that he's also making about getting married and how he wants to leave his wild days with jaguar skins behind him or leopard skins behind him and go into a chaste, more sacred, beautiful life. But if I had showed you these two paintings side by side, the 19-year-old Scheffer versus the 51-year-old Scheffer, 46, how old is he? Because he was born in 95, and he did the one on the left in 51.
56.
So he's 56 years old. He's getting married for the first time. 19-year-old Scheffer on the right, 56-year-old Scheffer on the left. 40 years almost of distance. Are they both informed by classicism? It's interesting how much he's changed over this time, isn't it? I could spend a lot of time working on this, but I want to talk about his last 8 years because it's about the time that he gets married. His mother dies, his brother dies, and several of his close friends pass away, and he becomes again, and think about this too, he's been isolated because the royal family who he served, there was a social circle, one of his big social circles, they're in exile. And so he's attending their funerals too, as they pass away and his family members pass away. And he's leading a very sad and isolated life. He's no longer part of the mainstream. Critically, he's been shut out by Baudelaire and his acolytes. And there's a quote from the time that was the woman who wrote his life right after he died, who said, "I've heard him say that having made acquaintance with most of the best writers," which isn't a joke. I mean, he knew the best writers of his age. He knew Victor Hugo. He knew Alexandre Dumas. He led Dumas as his captain in the National Guard. That gives you an idea of how connected this man is, right? He took little or no pleasure in reading books of a secondary order, even though they might possess great merit in their way. But the books of the Old Testament were perhaps the most frequently seen in his hand during the last 8 years of his life. What does he spend the last years of his life making? Almost exclusively religious images. Christ the Consolator, which, by the way, is what this artist was looking at when he made his 15 years later. If I was working on my master's or PhD at Brigham Young University, and I don't know how many of you have the possibility of doing that here, I would try and find out about a lot of these artists that we're obsessed with in this local culture and their connection to Ary Scheffer. Because Ary Scheffer was a much more august and important figure in the history of art than Karl Bloch and Heinrich Hoffmann, even though I'm not taking away from their artistic merits. And he was, I believe, if you do research, the most distributed artist of the era that they were looking at when they were making their own images. And when I show you the religious images that are coming up, you'll see that Scheffer has not created a Catholic Christ, but a kind of universal Christ that became the model for a lot of these figures working at the time. Here is his Christ the Renumerator. And after we're done with our lecture, I hope you'll take the opportunity to walk around the corner and see the Denial of Peter, which is a monumental work that is here at the BYU Museum of Art, just around the corner from us. And you can see Scheffer's work in person. Christ Weeping Over Jerusalem, which I have an anecdote from. I have an anecdote that it was sitting on his easel, and this was painted, even though it says 1851, the year that Napoleon III crowned himself president for life in France. And Scheffer was so embittered, saying that all of my revolutionary ideals have been destroyed by Napoleon III and his government. I can only hope that we'll be able to live someday and to see the revolution finally, its ideals restored, and a constitution reinstated. And he said this, it was like Christ weeping over Jerusalem. That's how he felt, personally. So even his religious images take on this kind of political stance during his last days. Here's a pastel and crayon and paper. Here's a study for larger work. Does anybody recognize the middle figure of the Magi in the three Magi? It's his friend Franz Liszt who posed for it. Judas Kiss, John the Beloved, Ruth and Naomi. This is the version that's at the Louvre. This is the version that's at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, side by side. And then his last work, which was considered many to be his greatest work, and I don't know how you can calculate that after looking at everything we've looked at, The Temptation of Christ, done in 1854. He died 2 years after painting this. What do you think about this work? I know it's a very broad question. But look, we've been through this man's career, right? This is the last image I'm showing you of his work. We've been through his youthful orphan paintings. We've been through his early neoclassical stage. We've been through his obsession with Géricault and Delacroix stage of the Romantic era. We've seen some of his portraits. We've seen his genre images, which are a kind of strange mix of De La Roche and Eng and Bronzino and Parmigianino that are inspired by contemporary literature. And now we're at his mature stage after seeing the Parthenon sculptures, and he's doing biblical scenes that are not for any particular patron, that are for his own private work. What has he come to at the end of his career? What is this work?
He's saying classicism or romanticism?
The devil is romanticism?
The heavens or the earth?
So philosophically, are you a classicist or no? It's a very, he had to repaint, he said, at least 6 times the figure of Satan before he felt like he got it right. It sat on the easel for 3 years.
I think he felt really torn his whole life between two worlds. And this is another example of it.
You think so? You think so? Does this feel like 2 styles in one painting to you?
It does in a way. And just the light and dark sides of politics and art movements and yeah.
For anyone here, go ahead, Michael, please.
It's a curious depiction of Christ because it really looks like a painting influenced by statuary process.
Oh my heavens, it does, doesn't it? That's a great observation. And a lot of artists used maquettes and did their own sculpting. I forgot to say that during our lecture of Jean-Paul Laurent, our last artist, he made sculptures of every one of his pieces while he was working on the paintings to use as models, maquettes, as he was going along. I don't know if the same was true for Ary Scheffer. It's good. It's an interesting question.
It could be the influence of the Parthenon sculpture.
It could be. It could be. I mean, he's got this. He's really used that drapery in a way that's extremely effective.
It's even painted in such a way that it looks like a painting of a painted sculpture.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it looks like a tableau.
Yeah, I was going to remark that the figure of Satan almost looks like a Carpeaux sculpture. It's beautiful.
And I wouldn't be surprised if he had known and had looked at something like a Carpeaux, who was one of these. I mean, how do you fit Carpeaux into his style? Because he was so classically informed, but he was totally willing to go to an emotional, dramatic level with his works. I'm going to read you a quote that he writes his daughter right before he passes away. He said, "It is positively something absurd and provoking to think of how my life has always been, as if it were worried and hunted. Never have I been suffered to paint a single picture in peace, nor have I ever taken a step forwards without somebody at my back or some circumstance which hurried and embarrassed my course. Trust me, and Christ has said it, it is better to be a submissive slave than an outlaw." How do you summarize the life? And this is something I've struggled with, so I've been thinking this week. By the way, this is a statue designed by his daughter that's in the town square in Dordrecht. And now if you want to go see Scheffer's studio, it is the Musée de la Vie Romantique in Paris, which I plan on going to the next time I'm in Paris. But how do you summarize the life of a man whose father was the court painter to Louis Bonaparte, whose mother sacrificed everything, and he studied in Amsterdam, Lille, and Paris at the end of the neoclassical era's height, who knew Géricault and painted his portrait, the official portrait, who influenced Rodin, who knew General Lafayette, both father and son, who was the personal painter to Louis Philippe after having fought against him at the barricades, who then teaches those children unironically and loves them and does portraits of just for private purposes. When he leaves the royal family in exile, he does portraits of every one of the family members for personal use and keeps them by his bedside for the rest of his life of the royal family, and who then escorts the royal family into exile himself with General Lafayette, the son of the Lafayette of the American Revolution, and wins award after award after award until finally Baudelaire shoots him down, and he lives the rest of his life kind of in quiet, but still spending time with Liszt and Chopin and George Eliot and Dumas and Victor Hugo. And now, when was the last time a retrospective of his work was held? 1859 was the last time. There is no book that's been written about him since 1860 on his life. Mind-blowing, right? Mind-blowing. One of the most prolific and admired artists of the first half of the 19th century. One of the most influential, arguably religiously, definitely politically, who led a fascinating Hollywood-esque life. He could make a blockbuster movie about just several moments in his life. He has been almost entirely forgotten by time. And I think, this is what these lectures are about, right? It's about these moments. So, think about that. Think about who's going to hold the next exhibition, and I hope that one of us ends up spurring it. And the next time you'll see me here is on October 26th, and we'll be talking about Hiram Powers in 19th American sculpture. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for your comments.